Hoag-Fordjour joins us on set. She's a civil rights attorney and assistant professor at Brooklyn Law School. Thank you so much for joining us, Alexis. Based on that description, and we should point out, we're being very cautious, and we are not yet showing, because we're still reviewing the video. But based on that description that we heard from Omar, what's your initial takeaway?
Sure. First, thank you for having me. I also just want to make clear that my heart is really with Mr. Nichols' family. He is a brother, he is a son, he is a father. Memphis is in mourning. I think people are on edge only because of the anxiety and the fear and the hurt and the pain that is going to continue to come out as we see this video. From what I can tell, based on your colleague's report, it sounds like the police officers were pulling him over, allegedly, for a traffic violation. And use of force for a traffic violation is unwarranted. From what reports I'm aware of, Mr. Nichols is a slim-built man. He wasn't doing anything to warrant that kind of response from law enforcement. We don't need law enforcement to come in with tasers for a suspected traffic violation.
We heard from the Memphis police chief earlier today, who described the video as showing an unexplainable level of aggression. The description we've just had from Omar, the boxed-in car, the guns out, the screaming, the taser, is that consistent with that assessment? Completely unwarranted.
Police, our law, our Constitution allows police to use force. Our Constitution allows police to use lethal force, but it has to be in response to a reasonable fear that police officers have for their own life, a risk of fear to their own life, or a risk of fear to someone else's life. There doesn't seem to be any information that Mr. Nichols was posing a risk to anyone else's life. It appears he was complying. And again, that sort of force in response to, and we have to look at what the alleged conduct was here, a traffic violation. I think most of us, all of our viewers, have engaged in a traffic violation at some point or another.
Based on the outlines of what we know, based on what the police chief in Memphis has said, what is it that you're going to be looking for, especially when it comes to this video, and what particular part of that video are you most interested in seeing?
I'm really not interested in seeing the video.
Right.
I'm not interested in seeing another example of Black Death. To me, this harkens back to sort of the voyeuristic need to see racial terrorism lynchings, right? And this isn't divorced from the history of Memphis. Memphis is a community in the southwestern tip of the state. Its history of racial terrorism lynching directed at Black people is the highest in the state. There are over 90 counties in Tennessee. Shelby County is where some of the most horrific acts against Black people happen. I'm speaking in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And so this isn't a coincidence that this has happened in Memphis.
I guess what I'm asking is based on a legal kind of perspective. As we know, the Department of Justice is looking into this as well at the federal level as in terms of civil rights violations.
Yes.
From that perspective, I should have framed the question that way. What is it that will be most germane as investigators look to build a case?
What would a reasonable officer do in that situation, given the circumstances? And that's the standard. It's an objective, reasonable standard. And again, the Constitution does allow law enforcement officials in their official sort of conduct, carrying out their official duties. We allow them to use force if it's warranted and if a reasonable officer acting in that sort of same situation, not with the benefit of hindsight, but in that same situation with the presenting sort of conduct and circumstances. And I think the video will show that that force was not warranted.
When we look again at the data points, we're just describing them at this point. But again, the boxed-in car, the guns out, the screaming, sort of a verbal assault, and then the use of a taser. Is this, in your view, a rapid escalation? Does it show any evidence of this de-escalation training that has been really broad nationally since George Floyd?
Yeah, it's a real escalation, right? And I think it shows, it really underscores that training for law enforcement officials will not address this issue. I think it also underscores the fact that recruiting more police officers of color, Black officers, is not going to address the fact that police officers use excessive force. There is a culture of violence and force and control and subordination in the way that law enforcement operates, and it's not unique to Memphis.
if I could just pick up another question. As you look at this investigation, it's on two tracks. There's the federal track, and then there's also, I'll call it the criminal track in Memphis. When you look at this and the fact that these 5 officers were part of a Scorpion unit, this is a suppression unit, is that a key data point in the investigation?
I believe so, and my understanding is that some of the officers may have been in unmarked cars. And again, what sort of
what sort of justified that for a traffic stop?
Exactly, a traffic violation.
Right? Yeah.
Exactly. And this idea of a Scorpion unit to be carrying out sort of traffic violations, again, is just set up to escalate any sort of contact with anyone that they meet.
We know after the death of George Floyd in 2020, there were many calls for police reform. There was a push for federal legislation on that front. What effect do you think Tyre Nichols' death will have on that?
You know, that legislation is still pending. It never advanced. And I think what will really move the tide is the continued public demonstration, the continued public outcry. And it's not just in Memphis, it's happening all over this country. I know in New York City, people are demonstrating. My students at Brooklyn Law are concerned. And it's the voice, the collective voice of the people that's going to move this needle.
And we want to mention, we are keeping an eye on various cities across the country, including, I'm told, we have cameras up in Washington, D.C., as well as Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where the demonstrations have been peaceful. But obviously, there is a very impassioned public response to what we have been hearing about and which people are actually now seeing for themselves as this video has been released. What are the kinds of challenges when you talk about the police in America? We're talking about 16,000 police departments that operate with very different criteria, very different disciplinary kind of processes, sheriff's offices that are, the same. What is it that you think is perhaps the biggest challenge to changing the way policing is handled in this country?
Yeah, this country is really formed based on anti-Black bias and white supremacy, and police force, law enforcement, has fit sort of hand in glove with the formation of this country and the history of this country. There's a lot of scholarship and research on the fact that police forces are a direct descendant of slave patrols. And so to really address the issue of police violence and use of force in this country, there has to be a complete overhaul on what it is that we rely on police for. Police do not need to respond to wellness checks, mental health wellness checks. Police don't necessarily need to carry out traffic stops. And police are often responding to crime. They're not necessarily in positions to prevent crime. And so this country needs to engage in a complete overhaul.
Alexis Hoag-Fordjour, thank you very much.